The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, when James Morrison first laid eyes on what he believed would be his family's fresh start. The weathered farmhouse stood against a backdrop of fertile fields, its white paint peeling like old memories refusing to fade. James had paid cash for the property, all 300 acres of prime agricultural land that had been listed as abandoned for over 2 decades. The realtor, a nervous woman named Patricia Wells, had seemed eager to close the deal quickly, almost too eager. She handed him the keys with trembling fingers and wished him luck in a voice that suggested he would need it. As James walked through the empty house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. The first sign of trouble came just 3 days after closing. James had driven out from his apartment in Philadelphia to survey his new property when he spotted movement in the distant fields. Through his binoculars, he could make out small figures working methodically through rows of what appeared to be freshly planted corn. His heart raced as he realized these weren't random trespassers or migrant workers who had wandered onto his land by mistake. These were children, 5 of them, ranging in age from what looked like 8 to 16, and they were working with the practiced efficiency of seasoned farmers. The oldest, a girl with sun-bleached hair tied back in a practical ponytail, directed the others with quiet authority as they tended to plants that shouldn't have existed on his supposedly abandoned property. James climbed back into his pickup truck and drove across the uneven dirt road that cut through his land, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The children didn't run when they saw him approaching. Instead, they stood their ground, forming a protective semicircle around their work. Up close, he could see that their clothes were clean but worn, patched in places with care and precision that spoke of experienced hands. Their faces were tanned from long hours in the sun, and their eyes held a wariness that seemed far too old for their young faces. The eldest girl stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly, and spoke the words that would haunt James for weeks to come. "This land belongs to our family. You need to leave." The confrontation that followed revealed more questions than answers. The children, who identified themselves as the Hartwell siblings, claimed their family had been farming this land for generations. They spoke with the confidence of people stating an undeniable truth, their voices steady despite their obvious youth. Emma, the eldest at 16, explained that their parents had left them to tend the farm while they handled business in town, though she grew vague when pressed for details about when this business trip had begun or when their parents might return. The younger children, twin boys named Marcus and Michael who couldn't have been older than 10, clutched hand-carved wooden toys that looked decades old, while 13-year-old Sarah held a battered notebook filled with what appeared to be farming schedules and crop rotations written in a child's careful handwriting. James tried to reason with them, explaining that he had legal documents proving his ownership of the property. He showed them the deed, the title insurance, and the closing papers, but the children examined these documents with the polite attention one might give to a child's drawing. 8-year-old Lucy, the youngest of the group, tugged on Emma's sleeve and whispered something that made the older girl's expression harden. "Those papers don't mean anything here," Emma said finally, her voice carrying an odd finality. "This land has been in our family since before there were papers like that. Our great-great-grandfather built that house with his own hands, and we're not leaving just because some stranger from the city thinks he bought our home." Frustrated but not wanting to involve the police in what seemed like a misunderstanding involving minors, James decided to research the property's history. He spent the following day at the Lancaster County Historical Society, poring over old records and land surveys. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. The Hartwell family had indeed owned this land, but according to the records, they had lost it during the Great Depression in 1932. The last known resident of the property was a man named Ezekiel Hartwell, who had disappeared along with his entire family after the bank foreclosure. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, but no family had ever managed to make a successful go of farming it. Crops would fail mysteriously, livestock would disappear, and eventually, each owner would abandon the land, claiming it was cursed. The mystery deepened when James spoke with longtime residents of the area. Old-timers in the nearby town of Millfield remembered stories their grandparents had told about the Hartwell place. They spoke in hushed tones about lights seen in the farmhouse windows during winter storms, about the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind across empty fields, and about crops that would appear overnight in soil that had been barren the day before. Most dismissed these tales as rural folklore, the kind of ghost stories that every farming community collected over the years. But there was something in their eyes when they spoke about the Hartwell land, a wariness that suggested these weren't just stories passed down for entertainment around winter fires. Determined to resolve the situation, James returned to the farm the next morning armed with a thermos of coffee and a resolve to get to the bottom of this strange situation. The children were already at work in the fields, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. He noticed details he had missed before. Their tools were old-fashioned, hand-forged implements that looked like museum pieces, and their clothing, while clean, had a timeless quality that was hard to place. Emma wore a dress that could have been from any decade in the past century, and the boys' overalls had the look of garments passed down through generations of working hands. This time, James approached more carefully, calling out a greeting from a respectful distance. The children paused in their work, and he could see them exchanging glances before Emma once again stepped forward to speak for the group. Her voice was polite but firm as she repeated their claim to the land. But this time James was listening not just to her words but to the subtle details that had escaped him before. Emma spoke with the vocabulary and cadence of someone much older, using phrases and expressions that seemed to come from another era. When she mentioned their parents' absence, her eyes flickered toward the old family cemetery that sat on a small hill overlooking the main farmhouse, a detail that James filed away for later investigation. The breakthrough came when James offered to help with their work, suggesting that if they were going to share the land, they might as well work together. The children exchanged surprised glances, clearly not having expected this response. After a whispered conference, they agreed to let him help with the morning harvest. Working alongside them, James began to notice inconsistencies in their story. Marcus mentioned remembering when their grandfather had planted the apple orchard, but the trees were clearly much older than any living person could remember. Sarah referred to events from decades past as if she had witnessed them personally, and Lucy hummed lullabies that James recognized as songs his own grandmother had sung, melodies that had fallen out of common knowledge generations ago. The truth began to reveal itself gradually, like morning mist lifting from the fields. James found himself drawn to the children despite the strangeness of the situation, impressed by their knowledge of farming and their obvious devotion to the land. They showed him irrigation techniques that weren't found in any modern agricultural textbook, methods their family had developed through trial and error over generations of working this particular soil. Emma could predict weather patterns with an accuracy that put professional meteorologists to shame, and the younger children had an almost supernatural ability to know exactly when crops were ready for harvest. There was something timeless about their presence on the land, as if they were as much a part of the landscape as the rolling hills and the ancient oak trees that marked the property boundaries. The revelation came on a foggy October morning when James arrived early to find the children working by lamplight in the pre-dawn darkness. As he approached the farmhouse, he saw lights flickering in the upstairs windows, warm and welcoming against the gray morning. But when he knocked on the front door, it swung open to reveal rooms that were clearly abandoned, thick with dust and empty of any signs of recent habitation. The children were nowhere to be seen, though he could hear their voices calling to each other from the fields. The disconnect between what he had just observed and what he was now seeing sent a shock of understanding through him that left him reeling with the implications. Emma found him standing in the doorway of the empty house, his face pale with realization. She looked older somehow in the lamplight, her young features shadowed with a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "You understand now," she said simply, not asking but stating a fact that had become undeniable. The younger children gathered behind her, their faces solemn but not frightened. Lucy stepped forward and took James's hand in her small one, her touch surprisingly warm and solid. "We never left," she said in her sweet child's voice. "We couldn't leave. This is our home, and someone needs to take care of it." The story that Emma told him that morning revealed the tragic truth behind the Hartwell family's disappearance. They hadn't abandoned the land when the bank foreclosed in 1932. They had died defending it. Ezekiel Hartwell, facing the loss of land that had been in his family for 4 generations, had gathered his children around him one cold November night and made a desperate bargain with forces he didn't fully understand. Unable to bear the thought of his family's legacy being sold to strangers, he had bound their spirits to the land itself, ensuring that they would never be separated from their home. The ritual had worked, but at a terrible cost. The Hartwell children had been trapped between worlds for over 90 years, aging at a different pace than the world around them, watching as decade after decade passed while they remained frozen in their eternal duties as guardians of the family farm. James learned that he wasn't the first person to discover the children's presence on the land. Over the years, several property owners had encountered them, but most had fled rather than confront the impossible reality of what they were seeing. A few had tried to help, but their good intentions had always ended in failure. The children existed in a liminal space between life and death, able to interact with the physical world, but bound by rules and limitations that James was only beginning to understand. They could tend the crops and maintain the property, but they couldn't leave the boundaries of the original Hartwell farm. They could speak with the living, but most people either couldn't see them at all or dismissed their encounters as imagination or stress. The weight of this knowledge left James with an impossible decision. He had legal ownership of the property, but morally, he was now the caretaker of 5 children who had been trapped in an existence they had never chosen. The children made it clear that they didn't expect him to leave. They had grown accustomed to sharing their space with the living owners who came and went over the decades. But James found himself unable to simply carry on with his plans for the property as if nothing had changed. These weren't malevolent spirits or angry ghosts haunting his land. They were children who had been doing their best to maintain their family's legacy for nearly a century, asking for nothing more than the right to continue calling the place home. The solution that eventually emerged was as unconventional as the problem itself. James decided to partner with the children rather than trying to displace them, creating a unique arrangement that honored both his legal ownership and their spiritual claim to the land. He would handle the business aspects of running a modern farm, while the children would continue to apply their generations of accumulated knowledge about the specific needs and characteristics of this particular piece of earth. It wasn't an arrangement that would make sense to lawyers or accountants, but it felt right in a way that went deeper than legal documents or property deeds. The practical challenges were numerous and often surreal. James had to learn to work alongside children who could disappear without warning when strangers approached, who knew farming techniques that hadn't been written down in any textbook, and whose understanding of time and seasons was shaped by nearly a century of observation and experience. The children, for their part, had to adapt to modern equipment and methods, learning to incorporate James's 21st century knowledge with their own timeless understanding of the land. Emma proved to be a quick study with modern irrigation systems, while Marcus and Michael delighted in the efficiency of contemporary farm machinery, though they maintained a preference for their traditional hand tools for delicate work. The arrangement worked better than James had dared to hope. The farm began to prosper in ways that surprised everyone familiar with the property's troubled history. Crops grew with unusual vigor, weather seemed to cooperate with planting and harvest schedules, and problems that typically plagued agricultural operations simply didn't manifest. Neighboring farmers, initially skeptical of the city lawyer who thought he could make a go of farming, began to take notice of the Hartwell property's success. James deflected questions about his methods, crediting beginners' luck and good soil, but he knew the truth. The land was thriving because it was finally being cared for by people who understood its deepest needs and rhythms. The seasonal cycles brought new understanding of the children's existence and abilities. During the growing season, they were most visible and energetic, their connection to the living world strongest when the earth itself was most alive. Winter brought a different kind of presence, quieter but no less real, as they focused their attention on planning for the coming year and maintaining the spiritual barriers that kept the property protected from the kind of negative influences that had driven away previous owners. James learned to read the subtle signs that indicated their moods and needs, understanding when they required space to deal with their own mysterious concerns, and when they welcomed his company and assistance. The children began to share more of their story as trust grew between them and James. They spoke of the loneliness of the decades when the property stood empty, of their joy when new families would arrive full of hope and plans, and of their sadness when those same families would eventually leave, driven away by circumstances the children couldn't prevent or control. They had watched the world change around them through the eyes of visitors and temporary residents, learning about cars and electricity and computers through observation rather than experience. Their perspective on history was unique and often poignant, colored by their position as witnesses who could observe but not fully participate in the passage of time. Sarah, the 13-year-old, revealed herself to be something of a scholar, having spent decades studying every book left behind by previous occupants and developing theories about their own condition and the nature of the spiritual forces that bound them to the land. Her notebooks, which James had initially dismissed as childish record-keeping, proved to contain sophisticated observations about agricultural science, weather patterns, and supernatural phenomena that would have impressed university researchers. She had developed her own hybrid approach to farming that combined traditional methods with principles she had deduced from watching the land's responses to different treatments over the course of nearly a century. The twins, Marcus and Michael, had focused their attention on the mechanical aspects of farm management, becoming expert at maintaining and repairing equipment through pure observation and intuition. They could diagnose problems with machinery before trained technicians could identify the issues, and their suggestions for modifications and improvements often resulted in significant increases in efficiency. Their childlike enthusiasm for new technology balanced their deep respect for traditional methods, creating an approach to farm management that honored both innovation and heritage. Lucy, despite being the youngest, had developed perhaps the most profound connection to the land itself. She could sense changes in soil composition, predict which fields would be most productive in any given year, and identify potential problems before they manifested in visible symptoms. Her seemingly innocent games often involved activities that James gradually realized were sophisticated forms of environmental monitoring and soil management. She would create elaborate patterns with stones and sticks that corresponded to underground water flows, or spend hours in conversations with plants that resulted in healthier growth and higher yields. Emma's role as the eldest had evolved over the decades into something approaching that of a spiritual guardian for both the land and her younger siblings. She carried the weight of responsibility for maintaining the family's presence and ensuring that their father's desperate bargain continued to serve its intended purpose. But James began to understand that this responsibility came at a cost that was becoming harder for her to bear as the years accumulated. She spoke sometimes of dreams where she walked freely beyond the boundaries of the farm, of curiosities about the world that she could never satisfy, and of a growing awareness that her existence, however meaningful, was fundamentally incomplete. The first winter James spent on the property brought new challenges and deeper insights into the children's nature and needs. The farmhouse, empty and cold during his initial visits, revealed itself to be warm and welcoming during the coldest months, heated by fires that burned without consuming wood and lit by lamps that required no oil. The children's presence was strongest during the dark months, their connection to the living world paradoxically most solid when the natural world itself was dormant. James found himself spending more and more time in their company, drawn by their unique perspective on life and their obvious affection for both him and the land they all shared. The children's condition began to evolve in ways that surprised everyone involved. James's consistent presence and acceptance seemed to strengthen their connection to the physical world, allowing them to maintain more tangible forms for longer periods and to interact more directly with the material aspects of farm management. They began to appear in photographs, their images faint but unmistakable, and their influence on the property's success became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had initially attributed the farm's prosperity to luck or good fortune began to comment on the unusual vitality of the land and the almost supernatural efficiency of its operations. Spring brought the revelation that would change everything. As James prepared for his second planting season with the children's guidance, Emma approached him with a request that he had never anticipated. The other children gathered around her as she spoke, their faces serious but hopeful. They had been discussing their situation throughout the winter, and they had reached a decision that would require James's help and understanding. They wanted to try to break the spiritual bonds that held them to the property, not because they were unhappy with their existence, but because they had come to understand that their presence, however benevolent, was preventing the land from reaching its full potential. The explanation that followed revealed the complex nature of their supernatural existence and the unintended consequences of their father's desperate actions so many decades ago. Ezekiel Hartwell's bargain had indeed kept his children connected to their family home, but it had also created a kind of spiritual stasis that prevented the natural cycles of growth, change, and renewal that healthy land requires. The property could produce crops and support life, but it couldn't evolve or adapt to changing conditions in the way that truly thriving agricultural land must. The children had gradually come to understand that their love for the land might require the ultimate sacrifice, releasing their hold on it so that it could flourish in ways that their presence made impossible. James listened to their explanation with a mixture of admiration for their selflessness and grief at the thought of losing companions who had become like family to him. The children made it clear that they weren't certain what would happen to them if they succeeded in breaking the bonds that held them to the physical world. They might find peace and move on to whatever comes after life, or they might simply cease to exist entirely. But they had decided that the risk was worth taking if it meant that the land they loved could finally reach its full potential and support future generations in ways that their presence prevented. The ritual they proposed was as much a leap of faith as their father's original bargain had been, but in the opposite direction. Instead of binding spirits to the material world, they sought to release themselves from those bonds and trust that their love for the land would continue to protect and nurture it even after their departure. The process would require James's participation, not as a medium or spiritual practitioner, but as the legal owner of the property and the person they trusted to continue caring for the land in their absence. The ceremony took place on a warm May evening, as the sun set over fields that had never looked more beautiful or productive. The children had spent days preparing, gathering materials that held spiritual significance for their family, and creating sacred spaces in locations around the property that had been important to the Hartwells for generations. James's role was simple but profound: to formally acknowledge their sacrifice and commit himself to being a worthy steward of the legacy they were entrusting to him. As the ritual reached its climax, the children began to fade, their forms becoming translucent against the golden light of the setting sun. But rather than disappearing entirely, they seemed to dissolve into the land itself, their essence merging with the soil, the plants, the water, and the air that had been their home for so long. Emma was the last to go, her hand in James's until the final moment, her last words a whispered promise that they would always be part of the land that they loved, just in a different way than before. The transformation that followed exceeded everyone's expectations. The property didn't just continue to prosper. It became a model of sustainable agriculture that attracted attention from researchers and farmers from across the country. The soil seemed to regenerate itself, water sources never ran dry, and crops grew with a vitality that seemed to draw on some deep wellspring of natural energy. James found himself becoming an inadvertent expert on sustainable farming methods that he didn't fully understand but that worked with an effectiveness that couldn't be denied. More importantly, James discovered that the children's presence hadn't truly disappeared. They were still there in the way the morning mist gathered in exactly the right places to provide moisture to young plants, in the way beneficial insects seemed to know exactly where they were needed most, and in the subtle signs that guided him to make the right decisions about planting, harvesting, and land management. Their sacrifice had transformed them from guardians bound to the property into something more profound: the living spirit of the land itself. Years passed, and the Hartwell farm became legendary in Lancaster County for its productivity and its innovative approaches to sustainable agriculture. James married a woman who understood and respected the property's unique history, and their children grew up learning farming techniques that blended cutting-edge science with wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself. The old farmhouse was restored and filled with life and laughter once again, but always with an awareness of the loving presence that made it all possible. The story of the Hartwell children became a local legend, told in different versions by different people, but always with the core truth that love and sacrifice can transform not just individual lives but the very land itself. James never spoke publicly about the supernatural aspects of his experience, but those who worked closely with him understood that there was something special about the property that went beyond conventional explanations. The farm became a place where people came not just to learn about agriculture, but to understand something deeper about the relationship between human beings and the land that sustains them. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over fields heavy with grain, James would sometimes catch glimpses of familiar figures in the distance, children playing in the golden light, their laughter carried on the wind across land that would always be, in the truest sense, their home. The legal documents in his safe proclaimed his ownership of the property, but James knew the deeper truth. He was merely the current caretaker of a place that belonged, had always belonged, and would always belong to the Hartwell family, whose love for the land had transformed death itself into a new kind of life.